I always loved theme parks. The thrill of the rides, the smell of cotton candy in the air, and the distant sound of cheerful screams. But after what happened that night, I don't think I'll ever step foot in one again. It was a Saturday night, and I had just gotten off work when my friend Jake called. He had scored free tickets to Everland amusement park, a place that had been around since the 70s. It wasn't as flashy as the newer parks, but it had a reputation, one that people whispered about but never spoke too loudly. There were stories, of course, accidents, disappearances, but that's normal for a place that's been open for decades, right? Jake, his girlfriend Alyssa, and I arrived at the park just as the sun was setting. The neon lights flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the near-empty pathways. It was strange. Everland was never this empty on a Saturday night. But I shrugged it off, thinking maybe we just got lucky. We decided to start with the Widow's Drop, the park's infamous roller coaster. The ride had been around since the early days, towering over everything else with its rusted steel frame. It was known for its ridiculous height and the almost vertical drop at the end. People said that years ago, a man had fallen from the ride and was never found. The park denied it, of course, said it was just an urban legend. The three of us climbed into the front car, the lap bars locking into place with a loud click. As the ride operator, a bored-looking guy in his 20s, gave us a thumbs up, the coaster lurched forward. The climb was slow, agonizing. I could hear the old chains pulling us higher, the rhythmic clank, 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 echoing in my ears. Jake was laughing, and Alyssa had her hands over her eyes, but something felt off. Then, just as we neared the peak, I felt it. A hand, cold, clammy fingers, brushed against my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see Jake messing with me, but he was gripping the lap bar, both hands in plain sight. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was no one behind us. And then the coaster dropped. I barely had time to process what had happened before the wind ripped the scream from my throat. We plummeted, twisting and turning through the track at a speed that made my stomach lurch. But I wasn't focused on the ride anymore. I was focused on something else. The seat behind me was creaking, like someone was there, moving. Alyssa was screaming, but I couldn't tell if it was from the ride or if she had felt it too. I forced myself to turn, to look, and for a fraction of a second, I saw something. A face. Pale, hollow eyes, lips curled into a grin that was too wide, too unnatural. A gaunt figure, clutching the empty seat behind me, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, as we hit the final loop, it was gone. We pulled back into the station, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I turned to Jake and Alyssa, expecting them to say something, anything, but they were just laughing, high on adrenaline. "You okay, man?" Jake asked, clapping me on the back. I opened my mouth to speak, but then I noticed the ride operator. He was staring at me, his face pale, eyes wide with something that looked almost like recognition. "Which seat were you in?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. Front row?" His lips parted slightly. "And was the seat behind you empty?" A chill ran down my spine. "Yeah." "Why?" He swallowed hard, glanced around, then leaned in closer. "Because that seat hasn't been used in years. After the accident, we don't let anyone sit there." I felt my stomach drop. "What accident?" His eyes darted toward the coaster behind me. The man who fell. They never found him. But people still see him, sitting right where you were. After that ride, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with Everland. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the way the ride operator looked at me, the way he whispered about that empty seat, it felt too real. I didn't want to alarm Jake and Alyssa, so I kept quiet as we walked deeper into the park, but I couldn't stop looking around, scanning the shadows, expecting to see something or someone lurking just out of sight. Everland felt too off. Despite the bright lights and the cheery music playing from the speakers, there was an eerie emptiness to the park. The crowd was thinner than usual, and most of the rides were running with barely any passengers. Even the staff looked uneasy, their smiles forced, their eyes darting around as if they were expecting something to happen. We decided to grab some food, stopping at a small burger stand near the center of the park. As we sat down at a faded picnic table, I finally spoke up. "Did you guys notice how empty it is tonight?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Jake shrugged, stuffing fries into his mouth. "Yeah, man, guess we got lucky. No lines, no waiting. I'm not complaining." Alyssa, though, seemed less convinced. "It is kind of weird," she admitted. "I mean, even the workers look nervous. Did you see that lady at the cotton candy stand? She looked like she'd rather be anywhere but here." I nodded. "And the ride operator on Widow's Drop. He asked me about the empty seat behind me. He said no one sits there because of the accident." Jake rolled his eyes. "Dude, you really believe that old story? Parks make up stuff like that all the time to add to the mystery. It's just marketing." "Then why did he look scared?" I shot back. Jake didn't have an answer for that. Alyssa leaned in, lowering her voice. "I actually read about this place before we came. Did you know a bunch of people have disappeared here over the years? Like, completely vanished. No evidence, no bodies, just gone. I felt a chill creep up my spine. And you still wanted to come?" She sighed. "I thought it was just conspiracy theory stuff, but now..." She glanced around uneasily. "It does feel weird, doesn't it?" As if on cue, the lights overhead flickered. Just for a second. It was so quick that if I had blinked, I would have missed it. But I didn't blink. I saw it. And in that split second, when the lights dimmed, I swore I saw something move near the Ferris wheel. A dark figure, standing just beyond the glow of the bulbs, watching us. And then the lights were back to normal. And it was gone. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "We need to leave," Jake laughed. "Come on, man. You're letting a spooky atmosphere get to you. Let's do one more ride before we head out." I wanted to argue, but Alyssa beat me to it. "Fine, one more. Then we go." Jake grinned. "Perfect. Let's do the Hollow." My heart sank. The Hollow was Everland's oldest attraction. It wasn't a roller coaster or a thrill ride. It was a dark ride, the kind where you sit in a slow-moving cart and travel through dimly lit corridors filled with animatronics and special effects. It was meant to be a haunted house experience, and people swore it was actually haunted. I had never been inside, and I really didn't want to start now. But before I could protest, Jake was already leading the way. As we approached the entrance, I noticed something strange. There was no one in line, no staff member at the front. The doors stood open, the ride seemingly abandoned. The sign overhead, which usually glowed with flickering neon, was completely dark. Alyssa hesitated. Should it be open if no one's running it?" Jake scoffed. They probably just left for the entrance to. The hollow stood open like a gaping mouth, dark and uninviting. The neon sign above the door was off, and the ticket booth was empty. It felt like we weren't supposed to be here. But Jake, being Jake, didn't care. He stepped forward, grinning. Guess it's self-service tonight. Alyssa and I hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. The smart thing to do would have been to turn around and leave, but something about the silent abandoned ride drew us in total, like it was waiting for us. We stepped inside. The air immediately changed. The warm summer night was replaced with a damp, musty cold, like stepping into a forgotten basement. The only light came from flickering lanterns lining the walls. Dust floated in the air, making it clear that this ride hadn't been maintained in a long time. A row of small black carts sat motionless on the tracks. No staff, no safety checks, nothing. The control panel near the entrance was old, covered in grime, but our green light was still on. The ride was powered. This is so sketchy, Alyssa whispered. Jake laughed and climbed into the first cart. Come on, you guys are acting like we're in a horror movie. It's just an old ride. Alyssa sighed, but got into the cart behind him. I hesitated before reluctantly sliding in next to her. As soon as we were seated, the ride started on its own. The carts jerked forward with a creak, and the doors behind us slammed shut. I swallowed hard. There was no turning back now. The hollow was designed to be a short, haunted mansion ride, with animatronic ghosts, creaking floorboards, and eerie sound effects. But as we moved through the first corridor, something felt wrong. The air was too still. The animatronics were too lifelike. A mannequin dressed as an old woman sat in a rocking chair by a fake fireplace, her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap. She was supposed to move when we passed, but she didn't. Then, just as we were about to turn the corner, her head snapped up. I barely had time to register the hollow black pits where her eyes should have been before the ride dragged us into the next scene. Alyssa grabbed my arm. Did you see that? I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. We entered a dining room scene. A long wooden table stretched out before us, covered in rotten food and broken plates. Mannequins sat in the chairs, frozen mid-meal. At first, they looked like normal props, their plastic faces twisted into expressions of horror. And then, one of them moved. A man at the far end of the table slowly turned his head toward us, his mouth stretching into a grin far too wide for a human face. Alyssa whimpered, "Oh my God." The lights flickered, and for a split second, all of the mannequins were looking at us. Then darkness. The ride came to a sudden stop. We sat in silence, the air thick with something unnatural. A whisper brushed against my ear. "Get out." I whipped around expecting to see Jake, but he was ahead of us, his cart barely visible in the dim light. I could hear him muttering, probably thinking the ride had just broken down. Then the lights flickered back on, and we weren't alone. Standing between the mannequins was a figure, a tall, shadowy shape with arms too long and fingers that nearly touched the floor. Its face was missing, just a smooth, featureless void. It stepped forward. The ride suddenly lurched back to life, jerking us away from whatever had been standing there. Alyssa was shaking, gripping my arm so tight it hurt. "I want to get off," she whispered. "Me too," I muttered. We entered the final stretch of the ride, a long, dark hallway leading to the exit. The only sound was the grinding of the old tracks beneath us. But as we neared the end, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The doors that led outside were open, and standing just beyond them, bathed in the flickering glow of the park lights, was the same faceless figure. Waiting, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight as the cart inched forward, the grinding of the rusted tracks the only sound in the suffocating silence. The faceless figure stood just beyond the exit, waiting. It didn't move, didn't twitch, just loomed in the flickering light like it had all the time in the world. Alyssa was trembling beside me. "We have to get out," she whispered, her nails digging into my arm. The cart jerked forward one last time and Hack stopped right at the exit. The figure took a single step. Jake was already out of his cart, laughing nervously. "Okay, that was actually freaky. Props to the park for—" The words died as sass. In his throat, the figure took another step, and this time, we all felt it in a wave of cold, thick as oil crawling over our skin. The air smelled like rot, like something long buried, finally pulling itself free. Then the lights flickered out completely. Pitch black, Alyssa that screamed. I grabbed her hand and bolted forward, yanking her out of the cart. I could hear Jake cursing somewhere ahead, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. We ran. I didn't know if we were going in the right direction. I didn't care. My only goal was to get as far away from that ride as possible. But the deeper we ran into the park, the stranger all things became. The attractions were different. Rides that had been shut down for years were suddenly running, spinning, screeching, flashing with neon lights. The carousel twisted in eerie silence, its horses now mangled, their painted eyes bleeding black streaks. Music played from unseen speakers, but it was wrong. Warped like an old record skipping over and over. Alyssa gasped, yanking me to a stop. "Look!" I followed her shaking hand and felt my stomach drop. The people in the park, they weren't people anymore. The crowd that had once been thin was everywhere now. But they weren't moving. They stood frozen, their faces stretched into two wide smiles, eyes blank, staring at nothing. Jake spun around, his voice frantic. "What the hell is happening?" Then, as if triggered by his words, the crowd turned to us in unison, and they started walking. I grabbed Alyssa's wrist. "Run!" We sprinted through the park, dodging past the grinning figures, their footsteps growing faster, more urgent. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just toward us, their smiles never faltering. The main gate was in sight, almost there. Then, a loud heart snap alarm echoed through the park, the ground beneath us tilted. I fell hard, my knee slamming against the pavement. Alyssa hit the ground beside me with a cry of pain. The park was changing. The Ferris wheel collapsed in on itself, its metal frame twisting like a living thing. The roller coaster tracks coiled like serpents warping the sky. And then the airway they ripped open. A low guttural sound filled my ears as the very fabric of reality tore apart past above us. And through that rip, I saw half them. Not just one, not just the faceless figure. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. They crawled from the void like insects, shifting, writhing, hungry. I grabbed Alyssa, forcing her to her feet. "Go! Go!" Jake was ahead of us, already sprinting through the warped, collapsing park. I forced my legs to move, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me, whispering, calling. The exit was right there. Jake reached it first. He crossed the threshold and vanished. Alyssa screamed his name. I didn't think. I just grabbed her hand and ran. We crossed the gate. And everything went silent. No screaming, no tearing metal, no warped reality. Just nothing. We stood on the empty road outside the park. The lights of Everland blinked behind us, calm, ordinary. The sounds of the city hummed in the distance. Jake was nowhere to be seen. Alyssa collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I turned back toward the park, my heart pounding. The gate was closed. The rides were still. The music played softly, as if nothing had ever happened. But then, a flicker of movement. I squinted. At the entrance, standing among the normal-looking visitors waiting to enter, was Jake. He looked different. His skin was too smooth. His smile was too wide. And then he turned and waved, the same way those things had waved inside the park. Alyssa saw it too. She screamed. I grabbed her hand, and we ran. We never looked back.